one of the most seductive phrases in American politics, and that is, we need to return to merit. Except there's just one problem. That meritocracy, well, it never existed. So many in the military doubted black pilots had the intelligence or skill to fly advanced aircraft. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Justice Redesign. I'm Steve Teskey, retired judge, and this is episode 6, which is part of an ongoing Justice Redesign series examining the legal, economic, and institutional dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we all know, the acronym DEI. Now, each installment addresses a different layer of the debate, like from merit and neutrality to profitability and governance, with the aim of separating rhetoric from reality. And today we're going to talk about one of the most seductive phrases in American politics, and that is, we need to return to merit. Ah, yes, return, okay? Like merit is a vintage car we parked in the garage in 1962 and DEI came along and siphoned the gas. You know, apparently, once upon a time, jobs were awarded purely on talent, excellence, and dazzling competence until, well, inclusion showed up with a clipboard and ruined everything. Except there's just one problem. That meritocracy, well, it never existed. So, with that said, welcome to episode 6 called The Meritocracy Myth: Why Returning to Merit is a Fantasy. So let's start about the good old days, or may I say the good old days that never were. Let's start with what the good old days meant. Back in that day, hiring looked like this. It used to be unstructured interviews, referral-based pipelines, legacy networks. He seems like a good fit, but you know, that's not merit, right? We know that. That's familiarity wearing a tie, like what I'm wearing. We like to imagine there was once a pristine hiring laboratory where candidates were evaluated blindfolded by robots who only cared about skill. But in reality, it was Bob. Yeah, good old Bob. Hiring people who reminded him of, well, Bob. And Bob thought he was being objective because bias, you know, it doesn't announce itself, does it? It just feels like comfort. So you see, there was never a pure meritocracy. Before DEI programs, before diversity offices, before corporate inclusion initiatives, hiring decisions were not algorithmic expressions of competence. And let me just stop right there. Now, I want to make it very clear that there were DEI programs that were not being algorithmic, okay? That were not using the best practices and that were driven by diversity as opposed to letting the inclusion part of the equation, diversity, you know, equity and inclusion. Inclusion should be driving diversity, not diversity driving inclusion. I want to make that point right now. So let me pick up where I was about to go, where hiring decisions were not algorithmic expressions of competence. What were they? Well, they were human decisions. And human decisions are shaped by networks, familiarity, cultural comfort, legacy pathways, informal referrals, and, you know, subjective impressions. Many institutions claim to be meritocracies, but the merit being measured was often filtered through specific cultural and social lenses. Now, I'm about to share information that is difficult to cite and provide as resources on a podcast, okay? So what I do with each of these podcasts is I write an essay or an article that accompanies each one, as I did with this one. And you can find the essay on this one in my Substack account, okay? And it cites the research and studies to support what I'm sharing. I urge you, please, to read the essay and look at the sources that are cited, you know, in that essay. And you'll see what I'm saying. So I want to make sure that this is stuff that I'm just not talking off the top of my head. I'm saying based upon things that have been researched and been peer reviewed. Now, these human decisions, as previously described, they can be categorized in three ways, and this is all cited in my essay. The first one is called the culture fit or culture fit trap. See, without objective DEI metrics, hiring often defaulted to who would I want to grab a beer with? And this naturally favored people with similar backgrounds, hobbies, and communication styles as the existing leadership. The second category is called access to opportunity. You see, meritocracy assumes a level playing field. However, if the best candidate is defined by having an unpaid internship or a degree from an elite university, the system isn't measuring raw talent. It's measuring prior access to resources. I recall having been in management, okay, and I recall decisions being made sometimes by favoring the person who went to the same college that we went to in leadership, whether it's the University of Georgia or Georgia State University or Emory or whatever back in Georgia. And the third category is this: the old boys network. Referrals have always been the strongest path to a job. So before DEI, these networks were largely homogeneous. If you weren't in the circle, your merit was really never ever seen. So the so-called good old days of merit were days when interviews were unstructured and referrals flowed through homogeneous networks, and decision makers selected candidates who, they felt right. But you see, that's not meritocracy. That is proximity bias dressed up as professionalism. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, ladies and gentlemen, did not appear because employers were hiring exclusively on ability. Come on. It appeared because systemic exclusion was baked into the structure of employment itself. Civil rights law did not interrupt meritocracy. And no, civil rights law exposed its absence. So let's talk a little bit more about Title VII and the birth of structure, all right? And let's do it by zooming out. Let's go like at 35,000 feet, like you're in a plane. We're about ready to land this thing and get down into the weeds. So Title VII didn't show up because hiring was already fair. We just said that. It showed up because systemic exclusion was so obvious that Congress had to intervene. And when corporations responded, they didn't invent ideology, by the way, as some people think, okay, when they talk about DEI. No, folks, this was something birthed as a result of Title VII of the Civil Rights. And this was a response by corporations to try to do it right, to be in compliance with Title VII. So what did they do to increase diversity? Well, many of them did. Some did not. And the ones that did not are the ones that haunt us today, okay? And the one that the naysayers are focusing on as if they're the only ones that exist and are, because they're the ones who are not doing it the right ways, that's what naysayers want to do. If they're against diversity, and they won't say they are, but they really are, okay? Then they're going to point out only those corporations and businesses that were not doing DEI correctly. But the ones that were doing DEI correctly, and are still doing it, by the way, regardless of the executive order, and that's because they may have changed the acronym DEI, may have changed things so the appearance is different, but they have not changed what true DEI is, which is this: they built compliance systems, okay? They did training, they did bias mitigation, they have structured interviewing, and they have standardized evaluation criteria. They could afford to get rid of the name DEI if it just made President Trump and the administration feel good, all right? But what the administration doesn't know is that they're still doing DEI. So over time, those compliance systems evolved into what we now call DEI, okay? All right? Yet here's the irony. The same law that required employers to reduce discrimination is now being rhetorically invoked to suggest that reducing bias is, get this, discriminatory. You see, that's not legal evolution. That's narrative gymnastics. It's like installing seatbelts because car crashes were killing people, and 50 years later somebody says, hey, look, seatbelts are unfair to bad drivers. That's really what's going on with this DEI, okay? So what does true merit require? Let's talk about that. If you genuinely want meritocracy like President Trump and J.D. Vance and the administration want, folks, you have to build it. It just doesn't happen. Because it didn't happen before DEI. There was the opposite of meritocracy. People just called it merit. All right? So why do you have to build it? Because, as I said, number one, there was never a meritocracy before DEI. And because of that, no meritocracy in companies that didn't employ DEI. And there is no meritocracy now, with the current administration having dismantled DEI initiatives and programs. So true meritocracy never existed except in those companies that implemented DEI in the right way, as I said earlier. By letting inclusion drive diversity, as I said earlier, through structured hiring practices and promotion pathways. This is how diversity rises to the top, by implementing best practices that bring out the employees who will contribute to the mission and goals of the company. Because you see, white folks like me, we haven't cornered the market on talent, skills, and abilities as some people think we have, though they don't say it expressly. But come on, we can read between their lines in their behavior. We begin to see diversity grow when we are honest with ourselves that talent is consistent across all races, ethnicities, cultures, and genders. But it shines most, ladies and gentlemen, when we use tools and strategies that help us see that talent, skills, and abilities. Merit requires structure. Things like predefined evaluation criteria, consistent scoring rubrics, structured interviews, transparent promotion pathways. Without structure, hiring defaults to that instinct, to how Bob would hire, because they look like Bob, like himself. And instinct loves familiarity. Research across organizational psychology has consistently shown, and I remind you, it's cited in my paper, that unstructured interviews are among the least predictive hiring tools available. And in fact, the research suggests that without standardized evaluation criteria, merit is often indistinguishable from homophilia. That is the human tendency to favor those who share our background, education, and social cues. Yet they remain common precisely because they feel intuitive. But intuition is not merit and serves as a gatekeeper, favoring those with existing social capital rather than the highest objective competence. It is a preference without accountability, folks. The most compelling evidence for the failure of unstructured meritocracy, and get this study, and there's other studies, it's in my paper, and it's called the Blind Audition Study by Golden and Rouse in 2000. So the bias is this, that they hypothesize. When judges could see the performers, they overwhelmingly selected men, citing a meritocratic preference for masculine sound. But the structure, okay, what they set up to test this is the introduction of a physical screen, consistent testing mechanism. It removed all visual cues. You know what happened? They ended up choosing more women. That's right. The probability of a woman advancing increased by 50%. Folks, this proves that the merit was always there. It was simply being obscured by the lack of a structured evaluation process. Structured systems, by contrast, increase the probability that candidates are evaluated on comparable criteria. When those systems are implemented, something predictable happens. It's this: talent distribution begins to reflect demographic reality. And that's because talent and competence are not confined to just one race or one gender or one background. They run across all demographics. And the result is not preference. The result is visibility. When structured systems are used, something predictable happens. Talent appears from places it was previously invisible, not because standards dropped, because bias dropped. And you see, ladies and gentlemen, that's not social engineering. I call that calibration. Now, I introduced you to Jenny Clark in the last episode that is titled Inclusion is a System, Not a Preference. I'd like for you to hear what she has to say about this from her many years working with Fortune 500 companies to recruit talent. Please watch and listen.
AI went on to highlight research in what actually produces both merit-based outcomes and diverse representation, which includes structured interviews with standardized questions tied to actual job requirements. What these approaches have in common is that they make evaluation generally objective rather than relying on subjective judgment, relationships, or pedigree. And here's a fascinating finding. When organizations implement only merit-based system with these structured safeguards, representation of women and minorities improves naturally, not because the standards are lowered, but because barriers to recognize competence are removed. What strikes me about this AI analysis is the uncomfortable truth it reveals. We've been having the wrong argument for 60 years. The debate has been framed as diversity programs versus merit. But that's a false dichotomy. The real question is whether our evaluation systems actually measure merit or whether they measure proximity to power. Similarly to existing leadership and access to networks and pedigree. Most organizations have never had true merit-based systems. I know this to be true from having been an executive recruiter for over 20 years, including at one of the world's largest search firms. I know this for having supported recruiting efforts for over 10 years at 3 Fortune 100 companies and 1 Fortune 10 company. I'm not trying to disparage any of these organizations, but they've had relationship-based, pedigree-based, loyalty-based systems that they called merit-based because that sounds more legitimate than we promote people who remind us of ourselves, however unintentionally. DEI programs were created to address this problem, but they often became compliance theater, tracking demographics and running training programs rather than fundamentally reforming the biased systems that create unequal outcomes. So here's where we are. DEI programs are being dismantled, but the underlying problem, systems that claim to be merit-based but aren't, remains unchanged. This could simply return us to the pre-DEI status quo, where biased systems produce unequal outcomes and everyone pretends it's okay because of merit differences rather than system design. Or, and this is an opportunity hidden in the disruption, leaders could finally address the actual problem. If you truly believe in a meritocracy, prove it. Not by pointing to the absence of DEI programs, but by implementing genuinely objective evaluation systems. Here's what's interesting. If leaders actually implemented these practices, they wouldn't need DEI programs to achieve diverse representation. Competence would equal merit. And when that's consistently honored, you would naturally see greater representation across demographics because talent is actually distributed across all groups. The reason this hasn't happened isn't because it's difficult or expensive. It's because it requires leaders to give up the comfortable practices that favor people like them.
Okay. Let me move on to the pilot argument. This is one of my favorite rhetorical flourishes, okay? And that's when people have asked me, would you want a pilot hired for race instead of merit? So really, you're going to ask me that question. You see, when people ask whether I want pilots hired based on race, I always think about the Tuskegee Airmen. You know, the black fighter pilots in World War II whose bomber escorts were so reliable that white bomber crews specifically requested them. Yeah, that's right. The assumption behind the pilot question is this, when people ask me, is that race-based considerations lead to incompetence. Well, history shows something different. Talent exists across demographics, but systems often fail to recognize it. All right? It's one thing to hire people just because of race. That's not good. But if you start hiring people on true merit, guess what? You will actually see an increase in the hiring of people of color and gender, LGBTQ, and so on. Okay? So let's dive deeper into this question. And hopefully I show the ludicrousness of asking this question in the first place. And I have to start here. First of all, for those people who've asked me this question, come on, you got to be kidding me. Really? No serious inclusion advocate, including me, is arguing that. And second, what makes you so sure that pre-DEI hiring always selected the most competent pilot? And since we're on pilots, let's take a quick historical detour. Watch this short video clip.
Bomber crews literally requested one escort, the Red Tails. The 322nd Fighter Group, Tuskegee Airmen, earned a near-mythic rep in 1944. 0 bombers lost to enemy fighters on missions they guarded. Flying long-range P-51 Mustangs, they stuck to the job. Protect the bombers, not chase glory kills. That discipline under fire, it made those Crimson Tails a morale boost at 25,000 feet. By war's end, 15,000 plus sorties, 150 plus distinguished flying crosses, and a reputation that shattered prejudice. When crews saw Red Tails weaving through flak, they knew, we're making it home today. Skill, discipline, legacy. The Red Tails proved it in the sky.
Well, now that you've seen that, hopefully with some inspiration, during World War II, white bomber crews flying over Europe often requested escort from the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, as I previously mentioned, also known as the Red Tails. You see, these African-American fighter pilots flew P-51 Mustangs and developed a reputation for discipline and precision. Unlike some of the escort groups, and these escort groups were all white pilots, by the way, who would peel off to chase enemy fighters for their own personal glory, the Tuskegee Airmen stayed with the bombers. In fact, folks, most bombers were lost when escorted by the white fighter groups, while many, many more, made it home when they were accompanied by the Red Tails. They protected them. And you know, the bomber crews noticed it. And one phrase reportedly circulated among them, and it was this: if you see the Red Tails, you'll make it home. And here's the irony. In the 1940s, many in the military doubted black pilots had the intelligence or skill to fly advanced aircraft. Turns out, they were some of the most reliable escorts in the European theater. So to my friends out there who've asked me this question, if you're going to use the pilot metaphor, history suggests we might want to be very careful about assuming merit looks like familiarity. The Tuskegee Airmen weren't hired because of lowered standards. They were initially forced to prove they met them. And get this, when they were finally allowed to fly, they didn't just meet the standard, they redefined it. So no, we don't want pilots hired because of race, but we also don't want to confuse exclusion with excellence. They are not one and the same, okay? True merit isn't about who looks like the last pilot. It's about who performs. And performance, as history keeps reminding us, does not run through one demographic. If structured evaluation increases predictive accuracy, and predictive accuracy increases performance, then inclusion doesn't weaken merit, folks. It strengthens it. So let's talk about what I call the nostalgia problem, okay? You see, here's what's really happening. The phrase return to merit, which is what's going on right now, okay, is not a policy argument. It's nostalgia. It's the wish to go back to those good old days. Oh, they won't say it like that. Why would they, okay? It assumes there was once a level playing field. But the historical record tells us otherwise. Pre-DEI hiring was not pure merit. It was informal gatekeeping. And when inclusion systems expand access, it can feel like something was taken. But what was taken was exclusivity, not excellence. You see, there's a difference. So let's talk about what you can't outlaw, okay, which is, well, structured. And this is very important because if you strip all the DEI acronym and you know those DEI programs and some of these corporations, businesses that were not doing it the correct way, but the ones who are doing it the right way are still doing DEI, even if they're not calling it DEI. All right. And so this is the part that makes this very fascinating. And it's like this: you can attack the acronym, you could challenge demographic targets, you can shout about preferences, but you cannot outlaw structured interviews. They can't do that. I don't care how many executive orders, but that's the one that increases diversity, including, you know, transparent scoring systems. You can't prohibit them. And how about, you know, forbidding broad recruitment pipelines? You know, you can't outlaw that prohibition, and you cannot ban good governance. You can't legislate familiarity back into dominance if evaluation systems are disciplined. Okay? The only way to return to the old system is to dismantle structures. So for those companies and corporations that have that type of structuring in their hiring process, though they may not call it DEI, but it is part of best practices of DEI, they're doing DEI. That's the irony of all this. And I love it. So if you dismantle structure, well, you don't get merit. You get discretion. And discretion without accountability has a very consistent historical pattern. So in closing, let's be honest, okay? The meritocracy myth rests on a comforting assumption. It's this: that fairness once existed and inclusion disrupted it. But civil rights law did not interrupt merit. It exposed the lack of it. DEI, when poorly implemented, well, it deserved criticism, and I'm one of those who's a critic, okay? But structured inclusion, disciplined inclusion, it's not ideology, okay? It's engineering. And that's what true DEI is about, is engineering, not ideology. And engineering does not lower standards, it clarifies them. If we are serious about merit, we must be serious about structure, because merit without structure is mythology. And mythology makes for great campaign slogans, but terrible hiring systems. Hey, folks, I'll see you next time. In the meantime, please be safe. Take care. Goodbye.